Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast. We're here to talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. I'm Andy Green.
I'm Felix Schultz. How are you, Andy?
Good, Felix. How you going?
Yeah, pretty good. It's a beautiful sunset off to my to my left in the turret.
You're in the turret?
Of course, I'm always in the turret.
Keeping a watchful gaze over the western suburbs?
Yes. Lording
west.
it over inner western Melbourne.
Safe.
How's it out your neck of the woods?
The sun has, I'm in the east, so it's kind of come well and truly. It's past me.
Let's kick off this podcast by chatting about the weather.
That's when, it's been a quiet week. No, it's actually not been. It's been a very busy week. We have.
I had such a good segue, Andy, and he just blew right past it.
Give it another shot.
I'm going to do it again.
Do it
again. Let's kick off this podcast by talking about the weather. Has it been very windy?
I wonder what the weather's like in Florida, where I think Florida is where Eric Wind
feels about right.
Feels like a place that would be reasonably nice to live. Eric Wind is back. I think this is the second time we've had Eric on OT.
Yeah, at least a second.
Not the second Eric we've had on the show. We've had a few Erics, but he's one of the favorites.
We had on
two, I think. Eric who?
Eric who? Okay.
Eric
not even the only Eric watcher dealer we've had on.
Not even. Yeah. I mean, what is it with Erics and being vintage watch experts and connoisseurs? Should have asked him that.
Yeah. I mean, we had a good chat with Eric. We talked about authenticity in vintage watches, a little thinly veiled discussion of some recent developments and
a lot actually, yeah. And he talked about kitting out a couple of the new draftees.
Yep.
For the that was really recently actually, because we spotted him and Seth Curry, the NBA player, collab posting. So we went on this sort of rabbit hole of discussions around, how sports agencies contact him to kind of help deck out, players for the draft, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Anyway, that chat is coming up later in roughly 10 minutes, I'm going to say 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how heated we get in the next few minutes. Before that, Andy, what's been happening in the world of it?
In the world of it, we had a little photo shoot on the weekend for our friends at IWC, bit of a lifestyle vibe, took some pics. One of the local like OG kind of menswear. Used to be menswear. I don't think he's super menswear now. He still has a fashion label, but talking about Nami, who he's got, if you know Mason's, which is it's a retail store in Melbourne, but I think his stuff's stocked globally. Nabi Man is sort of his brands. He's done stuff with Craftsman's Co., which is pretty cool. He's done quite a few different collaborations, but he is a really stylish guy. So he was our IWC model. What did we shoot?
He did really well, by the way, RWC modelling. Couldn't have asked for a better model. The fits were on point. We shot a couple of watches. We shot a Big Pilot perpetual calendar. We shot in green. We shot the new gold and green Pilot's Chrono, the black Pilot's Chrono. I'm not 100% sure on the particular version. And Portuguese Chrono. Or was it a Portofino? I don't know. A range of chronographs and Pilot's watches.
It was a Portuguese.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
And it was bit of precious metal. The green dials on the Big Pilot was bursting, wasn't it?
I like the golden green, like yellow golden green, winning combination, bold combination.
Very Australian.
I mean, yeah. But of those, surprisingly, you'll probably see these pics on RWC's local social media account in the next, few months. I reckon the black Pilot's Chrono was the surprise winner for me, because if you showed me those watches on paper, I'd probably go the gold Chrono. But I mean, just the versatility of the black, it's really hard to beat.
Yeah, I was just impressed at how they all sort of suited him, which was makes sense. He's a stylish guy, but
smaller wrist, pulled it off.
Yeah, that was sort of what I sort of left with. Was it doesn't have a massive wrist, but not a single one of those watches felt out of place. So yeah, that was fun. What else? I mentioned last week I was going to see Barbie. I saw Barbie. I did a midweek.
Come on, Barbie, let's go party.
Yeah, I mean, I was excited from the soundtrack, which always comes out a little bit earlier. But yeah, it was a good time. I know you have not seen it yet, Felix, so I won't spoil anything.
I feel like I've kind of seen it. I've watched enough of the interviews, the trailers, and the world around. I'm feeling, you know what I mean? Like I feel like I've seen it without having seen it. But how many Mattel Barbie high heels would you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, I would say it's a strong 4. It's a strong 4 out of 5. Yeah, like it wasn't a perfect film, but it is very good, and I would recommend seeing it. Like I think absolutely watch it. You're not going to say this is the best film I've ever seen, but you're going to say it's a very, very good film, and it's
a lot of people saying best film of the year.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, sure. Yeah, it's going to be August in a couple of days, or tomorrow's going to be August. I haven't seen Oppenheimer yet. I'm not like rushing out to see it, to be honest. I mean,
yeah, I mean, the nuclear age and, you know, nuclear holocausts, not really my sort of wholesome vibes, RN.
Bit too real. But I didn't tell you about this. The Witcher. Netflix just dropped the last sort of Henry Cavill episodes.
Oh, okay.
So this is it, the finale. I think it is season 3. Finale.
Season 3.
That's it.
I know they dropped the first half and they've dropped the second half now already.
Yep. So I've just watched those over the weekend, and that's it. And I feel it was a bit of a weird season. Have you started it yet?
I have watched the first half of season 3.
What do you think? A bit of a weird season, right?
I think we were talking. I don't know if I was talking to you or someone else about it, but I miss it's done that thing of like it starts off as a small concept of like dude fighting monsters, which is great, and now it's like the whole world. And it's sort of like, you know, I just liked it when, you know, James Bond was about defeating you know what I mean? Like it's the scope creep.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you know, obviously it was a very successful video game series and the books before that. So there's a heap of, you know, material to draw from, which I guess is why Henry got a bit annoyed at sort of the screenwriters and the writers, I should say, and probably wanted to jump off it anyway, because it was sort of like departing from the world of the book and becoming a bit, it all just felt a bit weird. Like the first half of the season I think they're trying to be like a little bit wholesome and play into the Henry Cavill. And then I think, unfortunately, he's obviously left and isn't renewing. So I don't know.
It's Liam Hemsworth?
Yeah, Liam Hemsworth. I don't know that I'm going to watch.
He'd do all right. I reckon he's got the chops.
Has he?
You're unconvinced.
What's he been in?
Hunger Games.
Yeah, there you go. That's a 10-year-old film. Yeah. Like
a global epic fantasy franchise comparable to The Witcher.
Liam Hemsworth is famous because he is Liam Hemsworth. Like he feels like a Hollywood plant.
Wow. Okay. Let's not lose sight of the forest for the trees. We are beyond all things. If we are one thing here at OT, we're a Tony Trainer Stan podcast.
Yeah, it's one side of the coin is Tony Trainer, the other side is Chris Hall.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about potentially franchising OT the podcast into different markets, and just rather than use our native English speaking abilities, just like get the local market equivalents. And we were rizzing ourselves up that who would be the Tony Trainer of the two of us.
You're fighting for that Tony spot.
And it's easy to see why. He wrote a lovely article on the old Hodinkee, the reference point, on nostalgia and how it impacts the watches that are made and also how we buy watches. So first of all, entirely unsurprised to find out that Tony Trainer's first album that he bought was College Dropout.
It's pretty on brand.
Chicago, man. He's, you know. But
Chi-town, yeah.
There's a talk about, you know, watch design and designing for nostalgia, and that's something we've talked a lot about. But what I found more that resonated with me more was how we buy on an individual level around nostalgia, because this is something that I've been talking about. Like the watches that I'm drawn to now as a mature watch loving adult are the watches that I liked when I first got into watches.
Yeah,
I've sort of ridden the wave of like, oh, these watch things are cool. I really like this RWC Mark 10. And then I move on this thing of like, oh no, I want this cool latest release. This is where it's at. And go on this whole roller coaster. And now what, 10, 15 years later, I'm like, no, I'm just happy with the RWC Mark 10 that because it's that nostalgia that speaks to me of the time that that I got into, a simpler watch time.
Simpler times. Yeah, you're right, because take last week's guest, Mozart. That was one of the sort of the first brands I connected with. One of the first brands I was really keen to see at my first Baselworld. I think every now and then I talk about Vulcan and the President's Watch, which was a watch that caught my attention that I still.
Eric Wind was seminal on that. There you go.
Brands like Sarpaniva, just brands that you kind of come across like, oh, this is interesting, this is cool. One day I'll be able to do this.
And it's that one day I'll get an Aquanaut, or for me that was always the one that I would have.
Even the Omega Flight Master has been a big one for me. I'm pretty sure that was the first watch pick I ever posted to Insta. Was the Flight Master, yeah. And it was such a long time ago. I was so let down to learn that they didn't make it anymore. Like, it wasn't in production. It's still not in production, which is a bit weird.
No, there's many reasons why.
Yeah.
But I mean, so does that? And the other thing I was sort of thinking about this, and I'm like, you always sort of think about, in my point of view, an article. What can I write about this? I've got a pretty hard and fast rule at the moment too. If I go beyond that sort of infatuation with a watch of like, oh my God, that's so beautiful, that's gorgeous, I don't think I would seriously commit to buying any watch that was less than a year old.
Less than a year old.
So look, I mean, obviously I'm not going to buy a Moser tomorrow if they drop it, but say, Seiko dropped a new dope, design. I'm not going to buy that day one. I'm not going to buy it 3 months in. I'm going to wait a year, see how I feel about it, and then make that decision then.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's probably the smart decision. Obviously, there are circumstances where you can't always.
True. Yeah. No, you're right. But I mean, maybe it's a case of like, I might not buy that exact watch, but like so I'm looking for, I don't know, an RWC Mark 10. I can wait around for that.
Wait for it to pop. Well, I mean, you sort of did that recently, right?
Yeah. Like, I mean, that's, but I think there's also I think it's a consumer thing as well. Like, you don't get sucked into the hype, which is very easy into that, and that group think of like everyone posting around something. And even if it's not an active purchase decision, you can sort of, even if in your mind go, I think this is the best watch of the year, wait and, see what people think about it in 12 months time. Because, and again, Tony Trainer, he talked about it. He talked about how he has bought and sold the Tudor Black Bay like 4 or 5 times, which is relatable. And he sort of talked about the Blue 58, I think, that was released during peak COVID times, and how it was like, that was the thing for a week.
It was a deal, wasn't it?
It was the greatest thing since, I don't know, the Tourbillon.
Whoa, because it was the variation. The 58 was great. And I had one. It's funny because I sold my
Your 58.
I sold my 58 at the start of the pandemic so that I had a bit of extra money to start the podcast.
Oh, really?
Yeah, when I buy some gear. I was like, you know what? Don't need this watch.
Fair enough. Yeah. But where's that Blue 58 in the roster now? I honestly had forgotten it existed.
It was so hot, and yeah, you're right. Now it's sort of it's there.
So I think, for me personally, I want to keep. If I'm still thinking about it in the same way, months, and maybe years later, it doesn't have to be. I don't want to be obsessing over it daily. But if I go back every few months, and go, what watches do I like? What watch would I spend $5,000, $10,000, $50,000 on? If there's consistency there, I think that's the mark of a, valid choice for me, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the other interesting thing with the Black Bay, because I've sort of bought and repurchased and sold a couple over the years as well, is that as they've iterated that watch like that, I've become more interested in the newer models. But a lot of the interest comes from the original that I love so much. Like, I love the original Black Bay, but I look back and I go, that was a massive watch, like far too big. Wouldn't wear it now. Wouldn't buy it now. But would I buy the 58 or the 54 or the 39 Pele? Yeah, I would be interested.
And in a way, I mean, if you, I suspect this is not the case, but it's incredibly smart design in some ways. Rather than releasing the best watch on day one, they can sell you that same watch 3 times, making it slightly better every time.
Yeah. Do you want to come out with the perfect watch from the start?
Conspiracy theories. Hey, another thing I was sort of thinking on, around that, hypey watches and, the Black Bay, the Black Bay Blue, that was the watch of 2020 or whatever it was, and that rainbow Breitling. What are those moments for this year?
That's interesting. Because it's not always positive, is it, those moments?
Well, I mean, the talking points, or standouts.
What have you got?
That tropical dialed Speedmaster.
I mean, that was a big deal. No, I wasn't going to say that. I was thinking, I mean, there's other watches that have been released that are sort of interesting. I mean, what jumps to your mind?
I've been thinking about Shooter a bit. I've been thinking about, they're not there, I don't think. But they're almost there. Like, they've got this factory going on. They're telling that story. They've got this Lingy stuff that's different. So that I think they're on the tipping point,
the cusp
of maybe breaking out of being the Black Bay brand, the pure Black Bay brand. I want to see that.
It's possible that it's. I mean, Rolex. Before you asked me this question, you said no Rolex, but possibly that anniversary Daytona was kind of a cool moment. Like if we ever see that watch, we might be like, well, this is kind of cool. I mean, AP has always been relatively cool.
I think it's so hard with Rolex and AP and Patek because they kind of sit outside.
They do.
They're always going to be the coolest.
So even Cartier, I mean, the Normals I found really interesting as a release earlier this year. I think that was, but again, when you're kind of consistently really cool, it's like, how do you have a moment out of it? Breitling, I mean, the Breitling automotive top times was kind of interesting.
And maybe this speaks to the market. Like, again, we're now a few years into like a fairly post-fair world where we're getting like 24, or 12-month consistent drops. And there's not those big sort of peaks and troughs of release schedules. Like everyone's dropping something every other month. It seems. Hey, we forgot. We've been in something else.
What have we been?
A little video.
Oh, we did the Hourglass, talking about the Gerard Perregaux Laureato.
Yeah, I did a little history of the Laureato and popped up on their social media the other day. Have a few more going up there over the coming months, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, you have to link it up in the show notes. People can check it out. I mean, everyone knows the Hourglass if you're in Australia or sort of
Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia. Yeah, great opportunity for you and I, Felix, to help them out with that. So make sure you go check that out and show some.
Lots of totally natural banter.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. Coolest brand of 2023, coolest moment of 23. I'm going to force you to make a quick decision. Don't think about it too much. What do you reckon?
The coolest brand of, I don't know. I don't want to answer that. Maybe Tag Heuer, maybe the Skipper at the moment. That's pretty cool.
I mean, they've definitely got the strongest, like real good energy behind them. Like they look cool. They feel cool. Like the 39, the glass box is cool. The new Monaco's. It's a good answer.
What about you? What's your answer?
I think it's probably more knots. I'm going to say like, that's not even Tudor because they're not cool yet. Like they're in between things. I don't know. I mean,
even Hublot's like not been super cool this year. And normally you can give Hublot some cool factor points.
Yeah, that's true. Just got to pull up. What do I feel compelled to post on my Instagram every 7 weeks?
Every time you see it, vintage Piaget.
Piaget. I mean, it's pretty niche cool, but that's okay. It can be weird cool.
Maybe only watch. Maybe it's just the only watch.
Indies
are cool. Indies are really cool.
It's a cop out answer, but
it's a massive cop out.
Yeah, just the category of independent watchmaking as a whole. I don't know. I'm going to stick to it. Yeah, you're right. There's a few more months. Maybe something fun will come out in the second half. Or maybe nothing's cool.
Maybe we don't know anymore. We don't know what
maybe
cool
we're
is.
not cool.
We are cool, Felix. And do you know who else is cool?
Tony Trainer.
Eric Wind, who I think we just dial call and get him on.
Less of us, more of Eric. Andy, today's guest is repeat guest, frequent flyer. I think that's the way to go with it. He's appeared on Watchpro's Hot 100, one of the hottest vintage watch dealers in the game. You'll understand why very, very soon. Welcome back to OT, Eric Wind. How are you?
Great, Felix. Thank you so much for having me on again. And thank you, Andy. You're both living legends. Felix, we were comrades in the early days of Hodinkee back in 2010. So I always enjoy seeing your face.
A long time ago.
Felix does like to mention the early days of Hodinkee every now and then.
I mention it less. It's as it fades into the rear view, it becomes increasingly less relevant.
It's amazing.
The Watchpro Hot 100 is a little bit unfair. Basing it solely on looks gives people like Felix and I an unfair shot at even making the top 1,000, doesn't it?
You guys
I think it was unfair for everyone else. It's only because they don't talk about Australia.
You're in my Hot 100 for Australia.
We'd be in the top 100 hottest, watch journalists in Australia. Maybe.
we might even crack the top 10, to be honest.
You're top 5 in my book.
Those boss hunting guys are pretty good looking though. So you've been up to a lot lately, Eric, closing deals. But one thing that caught my attention, and then we've got a lot to talk to you about, but one thing that caught our attention lately was a photo shoot. Obviously you've done a bit with Rowing Blazers over the years. There's some sort of collaboration with Seth Curry. How do you end up kind of working and collaborating, even collab posting with, one of the NBA's best shooters? What's going on there?
Yeah, that was fun. He's represented by CAA, which is a great kind of agency for representing a lot of different athletes, particularly NBA players. And I got connected with one of their agents even 2 years ago, maybe, and outfitted a few players for the NBA draft last year, which was very fun. AJ Griffin of the Atlanta Hawks offered him a kind of a selection of watches he could borrow for the draft, and sized it to his rather large wrist. I had to put all the links I could possibly fit in this vintage date chest with a beautiful metallic gray dial. And then Blake Wesley from Notre Dame, who went to the Spurs, he actually picked a two-tone watch, which I thought was appropriate since Notre Dame is known as sort of the Golden Domers. They have a golden dome. So that looked awesome on him. So that was fun. And then they said, hey, would you want to do something with Seth? He's really interested in watches. And I said, of course. So I hired a photographer, Jared Coca, who's an amazing photographer, does a lot of the Rowing Blazers Seiko shoots, like he did Randall Park and Ronnie Cheng. And he's just super talented guy from Minnesota originally. I'm from Wisconsin. And we had a fun photo shoot and did a few posts. It's been fun, to do something like that.
I like that you kitted them out for the draft, because in a way it's sort of, you're doing your own draft of, future a list of customers.
Hopefully future customers. Yeah. AJ ended up liking his vintage date chest so much that he purchased it from me, which was sweet. And he is obviously a rather large man. I want to say 6'7" or 6'8", but the 36 millimeter vintage date chest 4-digit looked insane on him. I want to tell people that I hear from people all the time, even like a 5'2" woman recently was saying, no, I need a 41 millimeter. I need a 41 millimeter. And I'm like, AJ Griffin is like 3 times your size. And if a 36 looks great on him, I can promise you it was more than enough watch for you. So I try to
safe it as your phone lock screen, just like this. You'll be right.
yeah. I really should. Look at it. Looks sick on AJ. And trust me, 36 is okay for you.
Yeah, you'll be okay. One thing we like, everyone loves to do is sort of comment, and do watch spotting on athletes in particular, celebrities, athletes in particular. And there's always interesting choices. Did you give these young draftees any advice on their watch journey? Is kind of experience that exposure to them?
Yeah, I mean, we talked. It was neat to be able to meet with both of them and talk about watches for a little bit of time. I encouraged them to, first and foremost think about Rolex because it's just solid, and these guys get led down crazy paths. They sometimes get Hublots. I've known NBA players that bought those early in their journey. That's not usually the best investment, obviously. And plenty of other crazy things. The same draft I was outfitting guys, there was someone, I don't even want to say the name and be sued or something, but there was some other company that was outfitting a lot of the first round players with bust down Cartier Santos and all these terrible, aftermarket diamond studded monstrosities and atrocities. And I was like, watching the draft, like, oh no, these guys, like, they don't know what they're putting on their wrist. They might be thinking, that's all factory or something, but it was really terrible. So that was sad. The number one player last year wore an RM, and that's kind of like, okay, it's it's something, but yeah, I mean, I think you can't go too wrong with Rolex generally. You can certainly go wrong with other brands, no question.
Another story, a watch story you were involved in that sort of made headlines, I guess, in the space a little while ago was a particular Speedmaster owned by Scott Carpenter. Can you tell us briefly about this story and what happened with it? How you came to be involved?
It's a phenomenal watch. The condition is spectacular. As I think a lot of the vintage watch world knows, there was a famous dinner in November 1969 in Houston, I believe, where Omega presented all the astronauts to that point with a gold Speedmaster personalized for them, and some that were made, posthumously for the Apollo 1 mission astronauts who passed away in a fire, unfortunately, on the launch pad during testing. But the watch came from a member of the Carpenter family. I've never seen a market shift so crazily as that gold Speedmaster market. A few years ago, I was involved in the sale of one when I was at Christie's, and it went for around 200,000. Was a Ron Evans one, and then like a lot of things, it's gone up in value. The Michael Collins one sold in May 2022, I believe, at Heritage for $750,000 from his estate. And then in October 2022, Wally Schirra's watch sold for about 1.9 million at this place called RR Auctions. And I had been talking with a member of the Carpenter family about the watch, and of course that was far more than we could ever dream of. Like, the watch had been kind of $200,000 for many years until like at least 7 years. It was kind of theoretically flat at that value, and then it suddenly spiked. So we put it on the market. I offered it to a few people privately, including the Omega Museum. They passed because I believe they purchased the Wally Schirra watch, which was attractive. It had a replaced bezel. However, I guess the bezel had been lost at some point, but they had a new old stock version, and it had a little bit of a history. But Wally had some Swiss ties, so I think they were attracted to it. By the way, Omega also has #1 and #2 of the gold Speedmasters because they have Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew's watches that they were rejected as gifts due to the value.
Yep.
So they
I
don't
had
really
to go back to them.
they didn't really need another, but I guess they wanted it. And Omega was kind of spraying a lot of money out there after buying the 3.4 US, $3.4 million US tropical Speedmaster from Phillips, et cetera, that is a Frankenstein piece. So I think, people were very interested. We offered it publicly in January. It got, a lot of attention and some interest, but ultimately no one purchased it. And then a few months later, RR Auction comes out with their auction catalog and has 3 of the astronaut Speedmasters in the same auction, which is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen in auction history. So obviously none of the 3 performed that strongly. The most expensive was just over $300,000. So we saw the value go from 1.9 to 300 some $1,000. And then Phillips had one in their Hong Kong auction that brought even less, and then Sotheby's had one in their June New York auction that was under 200,000. So we basically saw the value go from 1.9 to about 150K in 9 months or something insane. So unfortunately, the Carpenter watch is still owned by the member of the Carpenter family. It's been a roller coaster to say the least. I'm personally happy I didn't sell it to someone at 1.5 million, and even though it would have been nice commission, I don't imagine
the feeling,
theoretically losing over $1 million in value, even though I think it's more important than some of the other astronauts pieces that came up recently. You can always play that game of who was more important, but the condition was spectacular. And it's just a crazy market. In the backdrop of all that is the Frankenstein Speedmaster. Omega has taken a hit, I would say, with these higher end pieces because of scandals. I've heard that thousands of watches have gone missing from the museum over the years, were stolen by staff or others. Unfortunately, that Frankenstein Speedmaster is probably just the tip of the iceberg with stuff that's happened there. And it doesn't exactly build a lot of confidence for collectors in the higher end of that market.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because as you mentioned, sort of the shenanigans and scandal that have taken place, and like I've heard similar things around the traps that this is the definitely the tip of the iceberg, and there's more to come, and there's more people involved. How has it impacted? One of the things Felix and I discussed when it sort of first the news officially broke was the impact it would have on sort of things like confidence and the vintage market. Obviously, that's your bread and butter. What has the impact been sort of to the more everyday customer? Has there been any fallout?
Thankfully, it's not affecting your average buyer of a 145.022 or something like that. Yeah. If anything, it's kind of drawn some interest to the Speedmaster. Generally, it is an incredibly important, iconic watch. I would consider it one of the top 10 amazing watches ever designed and to have in your collection. I think most serious watch collectors should own a Speedmaster at some point in their collecting journey or have one in the collection. It's one of those pieces. We don't say that about many watches, but I think the Speedmaster in particular is one of those all-time greats. Certainly buyers today of vintage watches that are serious are much more knowledgeable and aware of shenanigans than you know, when I first started working at Christie's 8 years ago.
Mm.
They're there's a lot more awareness about condition, provenance, everything else. You know, we don't have any sort of independent grading authority or anything like that, which other collecting fields
Mm.
have. Sports cards, stamps, even coins, video games now, old Nintendo games going for upwards of $2 million in some
Yeah,
cases.
yeah.
You know, comic books, gems with the GIA, etc. So that's a hard piece. These are also watches that were designed to be interchangeable. They're not like a static object like a comic
Yeah.
book or a sports card. I mean, they're a million times more complex and meant to go in for service and um, meant to, you know, during service, you know, watchmakers replace parts, etc., exposed to all kinds of different environments and things like that. So there's always going to be some forgiveness of some replaced parts, like whether it's crystals or movement parts, etc. But obviously, the goal is to have the watch as original and as mint as possible. Except if you like patina, like a tropical dial or something like that, then it's suddenly you want that, and values can skyrocket. So, yeah, I think overall, I feel like the collecting vintage watch collecting community is in a lot better place than it was, you know, even a decade ago, because people don't just believe everything they see written in an auction
Mm.
catalog or on a website or anything else. Like there's a lot more understanding of what actually may be at play.
I think it's really interesting. Like we talk a lot about sort of the new generation or the new amount of people that are interested into watches. And I think, yes, there's a number of people that are fairly sophisticated consumers. But I also think that, you know, this sort of situation with Amiga, I'd be amazed if it was isolated. I think, you know, that sort of behavior, it's so attractive. You know, you can fairly easily change one component and, you know, 10x your money or whatever like that. I'm sure there's heaps of that sort of stuff going on. Do you think this is moving forward going to be an issue sort of the vintage watch market will have to deal with that's new, or has it always been there and it's just part of the business?
I mean, it's been there since the first wristwatch kind
Mm.
of collecting in the 1980s. There's been swapping dials and everything else. And, you know, I'm always even skeptical of watches that I saw sold at auction in the 90s. For instance, you'll see Paul Newman dials and watches that are 10 to 15 years newer and things like that because they were interchangeable. You know,
Mm.
you could see all kinds of things that were out of range for what the collecting community accepts now, but that were done back in the day. So, and we would even see that at Christie's if a client bought a watch in 1999 and brought it to us in 2016 or 17, there was a lot of bad stuff we saw coming back. And I was like, oh man, I can't believe they sold this. But, you know,
Mm.
there wasn't any sort of internet, you know, watch collecting resources in 1999, and people were just doing whatever they wanted or thought looked cool. So yeah, I think yeah, I talked to one dealer who used to take out the Paul Newman dials because they weren't very valuable in
Mm.
the Atlanta 80s, and people didn't like them and put in other dials. And then when they suddenly got hot, kind of in the later 90s, he looked in his drawer and found 3 Paul Newman dials he had taken out and then suddenly popped those in random Daytonas and made a lot of money. But there wasn't a lot of thought about serial numbers or whatever, or that it should
Sure.
say oyster on the dial if it's in a 6263 or 6265 versus non-oyster. Even, by the way, you know, even the retailers back in the day had sometimes dials that
Mm.
they could put in at the request of a customer, and they were essentially interchangeable. Particularly you see that with day dates, but even there was a watch that was sold at Booker originally in the 70s that had an oyster dial, but it was essentially a non-screw down case. And I'm sure it left the store that way at the request of the owner in 1973 or something like that. But it's not accepted as correct and like didn't leave the Rolex factory that way.
Mm.
Uh, So yeah, I think there's a lot more awareness, knowledge. The you know there are actors that have historically just wanted to say everything is amazing in the world of watches, and they're like every watch. It's like the Lego movie. Every everything is awesome. I joke
Yeah.
around with Charlie Dunn, who works with me. Every watch is awesome. Everything's amazing from
It's
us.
true. I
Every
mean,
watch is awesome. So
we read the press releases; they are all awesome. We love them all.
yeah,
It's interesting. I just sort of want to see what, because you talked about other industries like having, the independent, card grading or gem grading. Is that something that would ever gain sort of weight with watches, or is it too big and too complex? Like some
it's
sort of
risky.
industry recognized.
Yeah, it's a little bit risky. Obviously, there are people that wouldn't want to see that happen. There's um, a lot of factors why you couldn't do it, but I think if it ever did happen and had authority and good people behind it, it would be absolutely change the game and increase a lot of values and confidence around purchasing these things. It happened with other markets. Baseball card collecting 25 years ago or 30 years ago before grading versus now. I mean, there's cards that can go for over $10 million. There's like I said, video games going for over $2 million, stamps, comic book selling for millions of dollars because of that grading. It kind of helps provide a standard. So I think I'm confident it will come into play at some point, and it's just whether it's going to be credibly done and done with in the right way.
Yeah, it's sort of
Even by the way, one kind of test case is eBay did this authenticity guarantee program, obviously for any watch over $2,000. And from all I can tell, it's been incredibly successful for their business. They were hardly selling any serious watches over $2,000. And now it's like they're just selling them like crazy. So I have the sense that it's been unbelievably successful for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, and I think it could work for a lot more of the mainstream and definitely newer pieces. We sort of talked about your profile at the start. You are a figurehead of the vintage watch world. You're very you are kind of a high profile dealer, and that works obviously to your favor. But do you feel more pressure whenever something like this happens? Because your reputation is everything, and the stakes just rise as someone else big falls essentially, and then there's all this fallout. Like, does that increase the pressure on you to kind of just be extra vigilant and on top of everything?
Yeah, I think we always try to be vigilant. I don't like seeing this stuff because it's obviously negative overall, but it also I like to make sure people are aware that this stuff happens. And, for every one of these we know of, there's 10 or 20 more that I know about of really bad Frankenstein pieces selling at auction for, sometimes millions of dollars, and buyers not being aware of what they purchased. So, the field of watches, people don't, and I've harped on this before, but there's no real independent advisory in the world of watches. Half the time you ask someone as a collector, ask their advice, they aren't transparent about an interest they may have in the watch, and they're trying to push you to buy it, um or vice versa. They're trying to kill the watch because they don't want you to spend money with that auction house or that person. I saw that all the time at Christie's. People would ask other auction houses for their opinion on a watch that we had at Christie's, and 99.9% of the time the response, without even looking at the watch, would be immediate. That's terrible, pass, sort of thing. Not
Then
like,
they
hey,
sell it 6 months later.
yes, yeah, exactly. So and I would say, or others would say, well, they're just trying to kill the sale of the watch because it's a competitive situation, they haven't even looked at it. So yeah, that in the art world, it's more interesting because people have their advisors that they rely upon to help curate their collection. That's just not done in the watch world, really. And I think it's a missing piece of the puzzle. Even the car world, people kind of act as dealers, but also advisors. And for some reason, people either only want to get the advice of the auction house they're buying it from, which by the way, they're conflicted. They want you to buy it, obviously, and they're going to tell you it's amazing. Every watch is awesome. But, I think people just need to be aware that they're really representing the seller and trying to push it as high as they can. They're not representing your interests as a buyer.
It's an interesting business idea, Eric. You might be onto something. That authentication services, there'll be some sort of PSA grading system. So Wind Vintage, I don't think we've even mentioned it this episode, but everyone knows Wind Vintage, your business selling vintage watches. But I've seen a lot more modern watches lately. Patek, new Rolex. Are we going to see Wind Modern? Is that becoming a thing? What's with this influx of new shiny watches on the website?
It's been interesting. I mean, it started just because I had so many clients who wanted to sell modern watches that they've racked up. And I used to try to wholesale them to other, dealers, but they would absolutely want to just purchase these things at like 30 or 40% below retail. And I was like, why don't I just list them? Like I'll charge a narrow margin and be happy to help you. And by the way, in many cases, people are then turning the funds from these watches into buying vintage watches. So it's a positive for me if I can sell something and then get a sale of something else. Or even if I don't get a sale of something else, it's pretty easy to list something. Our site syncs with Chrono24. And for me, modern watches, it's really a price game mostly. If there's 30 of them out there, why would you not buy anything above one of the lowest prices if it's from a trusted retailer and it's a real watch? So as long as you're competitive on price, you have a good chance of selling it, is what I tell everyone. If you're going to be way above market, it's not going to move. People aren't that stupid typically.
I don't know if this ties into modern watches, but one of the things that I find fascinating about sort of the vintage world is the preeminence of the discussion around condition, and especially as sort of prices keep going up, you sort of see these condition, the condition becomes more and more and more important. Is this creating a problem for the future? Are the expectations of consumers out of line with the reality of a 50-year-old watch? And how many more sort of NOS watches are there? And is this, sort of you're creating an unrealistic environment?
Yeah, I think collecting of the past was all about rarity. And definitely over the last 5-ish years, condition became the new rarity because, as I say, like maybe 99 out of 100 vintage Rolex sports models were polished, often majority of the time by Rolex or one of their authorized watchmakers at a Rolex retailer, essentially. So, or through a Rolex retailer. So, it's certainly extremely rare. I was always interested in finding unpolished watches. After my first Rolex Submariner I got, about almost 15 years ago, and I was looking at the watch and really wearing it and enjoying it over a period of a year or so, and then I really got annoyed by the lower right lug being so much thinner than the other lugs because it was over polished, and I was like, who did this to this watch? It was so nice. And you just gradually kind of realize that and become more focused on it. So I think there are definitely some unrealistic buyers. There's obviously a lot of restoration with laser welding or recutting cases and that sort of thing. I don't necessarily love that either, because I think some of these watches end up looking a little cyborgy because you've got this brand new looking case and then a worn, patina bezel insert and dial on hands and things like that. So I think, it's caused some market distortions for sure. But at this point, I think there's more kind of awareness about these things than in the past. And I think it's generally positive.
It's interesting. It is an interesting state of play. We're seeing a lot more. I mean, it's been a big thing for a while with modern watches, but sort of dipping into nostalgia and doing kind of heritage reissues. A recent one that we've kind of seen in the last few weeks is the Tag Heuer Skipper. I believe you're a pretty big fan of the original, but also a couple of those earlier, I guess, collaboration reissues. Think Hodinkee, think Revolution. What do you think of the iteration that Tag Heuer has come out with on their own?
I was pretty disappointed by the new skipper, to be honest. I really didn't like the design very much. I thought the kind of triangle hour markers and putting skipper in the register, I understand why they made the decisions they made. I read Cam Wolf's GQ article, etc., about the watch. It's the first big watch that has been introduced through GQ's box and paper. So that was cool. Kind of a world exclusive. They gave him a 30-minute head start over everyone else or something like that. So that was neat. But I really don't like the watch. I think it should have said skipper above Tag Heuer. And I understand why they're trying to say it's part of the Carrera line and everything else, but I just thought it was a mismatch of things. And I obviously prefer the original skipper line, any of the earlier models, and the Hodinkee skipper.
Okay, that's an interesting response, and I think that's interesting because most of the time people see watches and they kind of have a visceral reaction to I like it, I don't like it, I just don't like the look of it. And from the tone, and you've indicated you've done a fair bit of you've researched, you've read into the release, you've got a good understanding of it. Is this more a place of sort of you're very passionate about the original and it's disappointment as far as being close to the original as opposed to just not liking the watch, like if it came out as a standalone watch? I'm just interested in the thoughts around it.
Yeah, I think it's both. It's that even if there was no original skipper, I still don't understand why you have to put skipper in the register like that, for instance. Okay. And you can look at kind of all the early skipper references, whether it's the 7754 or the 1564 or the 7754, all the 7764, all the early references, and see and incorporate, given the platform of what they have for the Carrera now, where they should put skipper. Sometimes it's above 6 o'clock. It could be above the Tag Heuer shield, whatever. I mean, I think that they could have just gone back to the vintage models and see that there was never any text in the register like that, for instance. I think the colors were good, the blue and I haven't seen one in person yet, but from the thousands of photos I've seen on Instagram and online, I think the colors look good. I just thought there could have been a few tweaks. I understand, obviously there are some people that don't like the date or whatever, but a lot of watch buyers like that. I'm not so exercised about that. I just thought it was a few different tweaks that would have helped it.
That's that's why it's really interesting, because this is sort of one of the big discussions in contemporary watches is, we're not designing anything new. And that sort of Tag Heuer is that school of like looking to the past, but sort of iterating on it. The other way of doing it is creating either, for a watch from your own archives or a watch that you happen to have in your personal collection, and, you've got access to a really good scanner and you can make a one-to-one sort of remake of it essentially. Is that better, or is there a path that you would prefer? Would you prefer this sort of homage replication of the past, or sort of a modern interpretation?
I don't love the one-to-one reissues as a general rule. Breitling did sort of a couple almost one-to-one reissues, which we're very good friends with Fred Mandelbaum, Charlie Dunn, and I, and we just spent a weekend with him in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for the National Convention of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. What he was trying to do was take Breitling, away from what a lot of vintage Breitling collectors felt was some of the monstrosities in the catalog today to guide them back toward the past, and that it's part of a process. And it's helped them, it helped inform their design team sort of how the vintage watches look. And it was a very popular watch as well for modern Breitling collectors who didn't know about vintage. So I think that was understandable, trying to achieve more of a one-to-one watch. In that case, not many brands have done exactly that sort of one-to-one approach. But I think it's, certainly okay to be inspired by the past and create something new, which is what we've done with the Rowing Blazer Seiko models. And we're trying to do that with Zodiac as well, and do fun things. Obviously the Tudor that we did, things that are fun and playful and with that harken back to the past in some way, but don't need to be one-to-one.
So it is, and at the end of the day, it's individual preference. But what I can respect, Eric, is that it's an informed, like or dislike, and I think you've put the effort in to sort of understand and appreciate a model before, just writing it off. Whereas even Felix and I, like, I'm definitely guilty of it, of just kind of glancing at something and being like, nah. And I do like that you care enough to stop and break it down and actually go, this is what I like, this is what I don't like, and sort of have an informed take on it, as opposed to just a quick glance. And I mean, we had Owen from Oxwatch on. I think we talked about it before we hit record. Talking about those Rowing Blazer pieces, which are obviously fun and colourful, and that was nice to see, I must say.
Yeah, that's great. That's what, ultimately, I think the reason why the vintage skipper or skipper era, as it's known, is so valuable is there's nothing like it, and it's very fun. I mean, they can sell for over $100,000, which is crazy for a simple Valjoux 7730 class movement that typically, if you buy a tradition for the Sears market or something, might be $2,000 with the same movement. But it's really about being fun and distinctive and iconic. It's really a fantastic story.
And I mean, look, this is the first iteration of the skipper coming back, so there's probably going to be those changes. Obviously, we know the capabilities are there with sort of the Hodinkee and the Revolution piece, so I can imagine that it's only going to improve on those sort of touches. And also, it's got to be good for that vintage market as well. That increased awareness of a whole new market of people going, oh, this this ties back to something. Oh, that's cool. And then who knows what that
it's good. There's definitely a synergy and echo for the vintage models and modern, and it should be that conversation, I feel like, between the designers, the collectors, experts, and it's fun collaborative process.
I love it. A talking point, talking piece. Eric, the last question that we have for you is something we ask everyone, and it's for a recommendation of something you've been enjoying, reading, watching, listening to. Doesn't matter, just something you've been doing that you think the people listening, watching would also enjoy.
There's a great book, What It Takes, by Richard Ben Kramer, which is about that 1988 presidential election, and follows different people in detail as they run. There's no book like it, I feel like, in terms of an analysis of all the different characters. So I've been reading through that slowly, and it's interesting, particularly that we're coming up on our next presidential election. So strongly recommended, although it's very long and somewhat dry. It's extremely interesting.
I always forget that you're a real presidential sort of historian, aficionado. I don't know.
I guess mostly with their watches, not so much the history itself, but I find it very interesting.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Eric, it's been lovely to chat to you again. We'll have to, revisit our annual Eric Wind chat in 2024. Maybe even soon. Who knows?
Thank you so much, Felix and Andy.
Eric Wind, what a gent. Always lovely chatting to him. I suspect he seems like a very busy guy. Always, his bat phone must be constantly vibrating.
Yes, he was a little late to the recording because he was closing a deal, which, understandable, money talks. But he's just great because you can kind of just hit go and let him tell some great stories. Like he's very well connected, and he's got a he's got a good thing going. Like he's got a interesting business model.
And I'd say even more than that, he sounds nice. I'd happily listen to him any day of the week.
You'd go play some golf with him. You'd hang out with him.
I'd listen to a podcast. I mean, just sign him up on the side as like an audible narrator. That'd be great.
Yeah.
I'd listen to him talking about, business strategy of something successful leaders.
What would you have him narrate? Fiction.
No, I reckon like sort of maybe we were talking about his love of presidents, maybe a little biography of presidential history or something. Who knows? Look, if the Watchers ever fall apart, there's always something to fall back on there with this.
I think he's going to end up on Netflix.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's got to be 6 months away from a Netflix deal of some sort.
Sure. Hey, so if you're a Netflix executive, 1, pay your writers. 2, you can email otthepodcast@gmail.com to get an introduction to Eric Wind. You can follow us on ot.podcast on Instagram.
Yep.
If you want to show your appreciation and support of this podcast, the best way to do it is to like, subscribe, share, signal boost, X about it. And
Felix, you took that 90% of the way home, but you didn't mention our Discord.
Oh.
Jump in there. It's where the fun happens.
It's a hotbed.
It's a hotbed of watch activity. Possibly one of the only watch-focused Discords on the interwebs.
I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, so I'm going to claim it's the largest and the best.
And it's the most entertaining. All right, guys, we'll see you next week.
Tschüss.